So yeah, at this point, we're going to transition over um, to Astra Taylor, who is kindly offered to speak for our YDSA reading group, which we sort of impromptu integrated into this teach-in. So yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Astra.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. It's a real honor, and I'm so happy I got to catch some of the last panel and see some of my friends and comrades and get some of that energy and cheering everybody on. I guess I just want to begin by expressing my total solidarity with the Columbia tuition strikers and the solidarity of the group I organize with, the Debt Collective, which is a union for debtors. And we just really want to say that we're with you 100%. And this is something that it's a kind of movement we've been waiting for, an effort we've been waiting for a long time. So I just want to say that before I begin. You know, we're so accustomed. We've been steeped in an ideology that tells us that education is a commodity, right? That it's something we have to pay for. In fact, the heftier the price tag, the more prestige it must have. And to say, you know, we're not going to pay, and to just call that bluff, I think is incredibly important. I wrote a piece years ago, I can't keep track anymore, that was about the way that our schools are increasingly hedge funds with classrooms attached to them, right? So we've gotten far away from the sort of purpose of education. So we also, I think, feel a lot of solidarity with your attempts to sort of think what other forms of strikes we could have. And I use the word solidarity. I'm thinking about that word a lot lately because I'm actually writing a book on it. But solidarity, if we go back to the ancient roots of that phrase, it actually meant debts held in common. It was when groups of people had debts, and if one person failed, they all failed. So they bailed each other out. So solidarity always has a kind of material dimension. It's not just like an attitude. It's not just a tweet. Solidarity is being materially connected and being on the hook for each other and for your well-being. I think that's kind of a neat thing about the roots of that word, and its echoes with the debtors movement that I'm trying to build. So of course, when we think about strikes, we think about the labor movement, and labor strikes are incredibly important. That's where regular people have the most power under capitalist economic conditions. But a whole lot of us aren't in a situation where we have the opportunity to join a union, to start a union, and working people can't afford to leave power on the table. That's why I'm for a proliferation of all kinds of unions, all kinds of forms of economic resistance, or what we call at the Debt Collective, economic disobedience. So whether that's seeing more and more tenant unions and more rent strikes, whether that's seeing tuition strikes like folks at Columbia are doing, or whether that's seeing all kinds of debt strikes potentially, debtors coming together to wield economic leverage. I think we have to think about where we have economic power, where we can use, where we can come together and build power to challenge capital and to make demands. And so, you know, tuition strikes, of course, in a way are a kind of preemptive student debt strike because it's a way, it anticipates what's coming, right? Which is, having for most people, for most students, the average student borrower graduates, I think, with like $35,000 of student debt, anticipates the economic scenario to come. And, I think the idea that a tuition strike is more about, it's about more, as you all are saying, right, with your demands. It's about more than just wanting a discount. You're making demands about the entire university, including, demands for fossil fuel divestment, which Columbia agreed to today, which is really powerful. It shows that using these creative forms of economic leverage can lead to a broader set of victories. So I guess what I want to do is tell you all a bit about the Debt Collective and Can't Pay, Won't Pay. I tried to be like a real webinar person, put my little book right here. That's how they do it. I've seen it on the internet. Can't Pay, Won't Pay is our manifesto. It's collectively authored manifesto by some of us who founded the Debt Collective. And once again, the Debt Collective is a union for debtors. And the book is called The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. We use that phrase abolition really purposefully. And I wrote the preface to, in a more sort of personal vein. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But essentially, we're trying to think of forms of building economic power. Where can people come together and have leverage? So one way of telling this sort of story, the history, the backdrop that gets us here, is looking at the history of what we often call financialization. So beginning in the late 70s, right in the 80s, think about Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, our economy financialized. Sometimes people talk about this in terms of neoliberalism. But basically, these financial games became more central to our economy. And wages stagnated for working people. There was a conservative backlash that had different facets, but one was that there were attacks on welfare, on state services, attacks on labor unions, and the state was kind of captured to protect and insulate the market from democratic demands from regular people. What happened at this point is wages stagnated for people, is that easy access to credit kind of covered that up. So that's when you see this explosion of household debt. You see people borrowing to make ends meet. So one way of thinking about this is, people are underpaid at the job, and then they're forced to borrow the difference. So we're robbed twice, right? You're underpaid by your boss, and then you have to take out a payday loan at the end of the month. You have to put your rent and groceries on a credit card, your medical debts, which are a huge part of what people put on credit cards. And the data shows this. There's always going to be the stereotype of people putting stuff they can't afford on their credit cards, right? But it's just, research doesn't bear that out. People put necessities on their credit cards, and the typical reason people take out a payday loan, well, it's often a single mother who wants to not be evicted so that her kids and herself don't have to sleep on the street. So that access to credit kind of created this illusion of shared prosperity. But what it really did was drive people into debt. So, the American dream, which used to be owning your house outright, is now just getting to $0 for lots of people. And we see records being broken, so even before the pandemic, household debt reached over $14 trillion. So that's, a record sum. And of course, this system, basically concentrates wealth and power because, the banking sector, something like 30% of their profit, it's the biggest industry, or one of the biggest industries, along with fossil fuels, big tech, these sort of extractive industries, 30% of their business is just fees. It's not even interest, as though they're not getting paid for intelligently allocating capital or something like that, right? They're basically charging rents for access to the resources people need to survive and thrive. So financialization was a way of reorganizing the economy, but it also opened up new possibilities for organizing people. So the whole point is that our debts are somebody else's assets, right? Our debts are owned by somebody else. They're bundled together. Sometimes they're securitized. Sometimes they're traded on Wall Street, and people profit from them. People who didn't provide any service to us. So this happens in a really mundane way. When a debt collector calls you on the phone and says, you owe me $300 for that trip to the emergency room, that debt collector had nothing to do with providing you an actually valuable service, right? They're just a middleman who bought your debt and is trying to make a buck off of it. So one thing we're trying to do is sort of dispel some of the illusions of the system to try to show how it works and how exploitative it is. I mean, debt is basically a way to profit off of people's economic desperation and profit off their poverty and profit off of their pain. So it opens up new ways of organizing us. How? Because again, our debts are somebody else's asset. They can be withheld. They can be used as a form of leverage. And so that's where the slogan on the cover of the book is can't pay, won't pay. The fact is a lot of people cannot pay their debts. They're not paying their debts. And of course, there's the ways in which debtors who can't pay are punished by the system. So your credit score is destroyed, which means then you're charged even more when you try to borrow. In some places, if you default on your student loans, the state can take away your driver's license, right? I mean, it's quite a punitive system for debtors. But nevertheless, we believe that there's something about people responding to this. There's something powerful about people who are in this desperate economic condition saying, I can't pay, I won't pay, and I shouldn't pay. that there's a kind of politicization that happens, and then we can tap into that potential economic power and economic leverage. And we've had enough success, showing that this can be done through our sort of pilot campaigns, which have focused specifically around student debt. So I want to talk a little bit about that. For me, in a way, this started personally, as it did with so many debtors that we organize with. So we often talk about student debt in these big abstractions. It's $1.7 trillion. Over 1 million debtors default on their student debtors default every year. But each one of these numbers is a person who's struggling and who's being stressed out. In fact, there's lots of research that shows that being in debt, really has damaging consequences for both body and mind. It actually makes people sick. Being in debt makes you even less likely to go see a doctor. It has mental health consequences, all these things. And so, 10 years ago, that was me. I defaulted on my student loans. I went to the new school, so not Columbia, but not far. I went to the new school and I couldn't pay my student loans. And I remember I got this phone call and they're like, "You're in default." And I said, "Oh," and they said, "Well, now your principal has gone up 19%. So it went up something like another $15,000 or something like that." So, and it was just this illogic, right? Of, okay, I can't pay. And so your solution is to destroy my credit and to bury me deeper in a debt hole from which I will never escape. But at that moment, there was no collectivity. There was no political consciousness or analysis around debt. So I was alone in that. I was mad. I felt in my bones that this was a political problem, and that I kind of knew from reading history that education had been free or basically low tuition, low fee for most of American educational history. In fact, that is the principle on which American public universities were founded. But just like the last speaker said, you can't be a socialist alone. So I was by myself with my frustration at my economic condition. It took Occupy Wall Street for me to realize that there are other people who felt the same way. So the Debt Collective has roots in Occupy Wall Street. 2012, some of the founders of Occupy Wall Street launched something called the Occupy Student Debt Campaign. And they had a protest called One Tea Day in November 2012 when student debt surpassed $1 trillion. I note that because we're probably going to be protesting 2 Tea Day under Joe Biden unless he freaking cancels all student debt, which he has the power to do this afternoon. So that just also shows you how fast this problem expands, and it shows you just the reality of compound interest, right? So we are approaching 2 Tea Day. So some of us got together out of that original mix at Occupy and had this vision of a debtors union. And we launched in 2015, we launched the first ever student debt strike. We worked with students from a predatory for-profit college called Corinthian Colleges, Inc. These for-profit colleges serve hundreds and hundreds of thousands of students at one institution. They charge people the max that they can get from the federal student loan system, and they bury them in debt for worthless degrees. They lie to them. They're very fraudulent entities. We launched a strike with the Corinthian 15 student debt strikers. Their numbers swelled. And then we created a creative legal strategy. We basically looked at the laws and realized that people have lots of rights on the books that are not being respected. So what if we, bureaucracy is so often weaponized against the poor. It's hard to access your rights. It's hard to dispute your debts, whatever. What if we tried to weaponize it for a progressive aim? So we created a way to dispute these fraudulent debts. We made it really easy. We made it so people could do it on their mobile phone because poor people don't have computers or printers, right? You can't skip work to go to the library to use some broken system to print something out. And what we did was we flooded the Obama administration with legal disputes and created a crisis that led to a rulemaking session, changes to federal law. There were lawsuits, and we won over $1 billion with a B of debt cancellation for the Corinthian students. And through that campaign, not only did we prove mass cancellation could be done, and we normalized this idea that student debt should be canceled, not that everyone accepts it, but we got it onto the public agenda. And some of our policy work eventually was picked up by Senator Elizabeth Warren, and our policy work basically identified what the precise legal mechanism by which any sitting president can cancel a student debt. So flash forward to now. On the first day of the Biden administration, we launched something called the Biden Jubilee 100, which it's symbolic 100 strikers symbolic in that they represent his first 100 days. They come from all walks of life. People should check out the Biden Jubilee webpage to kind of see, again, to see the people, right? Not just these abstract numbers. They're young, they're old, they're Black, they're white, there's doctors, there's a pastor, there are gig workers, there's a grandma, there's young people just starting their lives out. And they're basically saying, we can't pay, we won't pay, and we demand that the Biden administration cancel student debt using compromise and settlement authority, which is this authority that our organization has helped identify and normalize and sort of push. And it's a way of calling the bluff of power and saying, we know you can do this, right? We know that you actually can do this, because they, the Democrats, I mean, all politicians, but Democrats, love to say we can't do this and that, or, the Republicans won't let us, or whatever it is. So this is something where we're being very specific and very precise and saying, actually, this is not just some overreach of executive authority to say Joe Biden should cancel all student debt using compromise and settlement. What it is actually, it's more interesting than that. In the Higher Education Act of 1965, Congress already granted the Department of Education the ability to cancel student debt. The ability to create debt implies the ability to cancel it. So we're saying use the power that's been in the presidency's possession for decades to admit that this is a policy failure. And when I say policy failure, I mean, I don't think I'll be telling people here what they don't know, but again, public education was not always so incredibly expensive, right? So in a way, what people are demanding is just parity with previous generations who were able to graduate and not be buried in student debt. We also know that part of the shift in that system, I wrote about this in a piece for the New Republic called The End of the University, it was a right-wing racist backlash led by then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who wanted to suppress the student movement at Berkeley, who wanted to suppress the rising Black Power movement that was emerging at free community colleges in the Bay Area, and who saw, along with sort of neoliberal economists, James Buchanan was one of them, basically saw the imposition of debt financing as a way of disciplining students. Basically, if they have to pay tuition and go into debt, they won't play their psychedelic games, right? This is a way to suppress radicalism and using finance as a kind of form of social control. And this was something that Reagan was very committed to. And of course, it was, part of the beginning of this neoliberal economic era. And so I think, people who are in debt are right to feel that it's not just a bad economic arrangement, but that it creates conditions of unfreedom, right? And that there's a political dimension to that. So again, I just want to reiterate that student debt cancellation is something that is absolutely possible. It took a movement to put the idea on the map. It took a movement to win $1 billion of debt relief for defrauded for-profit college students. It'll definitely take a movement to get all $1.7 trillion of student debt canceled, but it's possible. And as Micah said, we're pushing the boulder up the hill. I feel that we've pushed the boulder of saying we deserve debt abolition a bit. We've pushed it up the mountain, and I want other people to come and join us and help us push it. We need that collective power. And then, right wingers love to tweet, well, what's next? You cancel student debt. Are you going to cancel medical debt? Are you going to cancel credit card debt? Are you going to cancel payday loans? Are you going to cancel mortgages? Are you going to cancel rent? Are you going to cancel municipal debts to our communities? And the answer from us is yes, that is the plan. We need to build a movement demanding medical debt cancellation and Medicare for all, right? It's a trickier thing in the sense that there's not just a kind of kill switch in the federal government that can be pressed easily, but it's something that can totally be done with legislation. What we need to do is connect people's lived experience. This is the solidarity part, your lived experience of indebtedness to these political problems. That's part of why this is powerful. And I'll end here and take any questions. Your debt is not your fault. There's a whole ideology of shame and stigma that is around, it's about making us feel that we are alone and isolated. That's why the Debt Collective slogan is "You are not alone," LOAN, but it's also about not being unique. Others are in the situation. So part of what we need to do is overcome that stigma and not see ourselves as debtors, but see ourselves as entitled. We're entitled to free education. We're entitled to having our debts canceled. We're entitled to having those credit cards written down. We're entitled to a job guarantee, to a Green New Deal. So this is also a movement about encouraging a kind of entitlement to shared prosperity, to freedom, to equality, to all of these things. And so that's why I take such joy in the tuition strike and people saying, no, we deserve to be treated better than this, because we all do.
Okay, amazing. Thanks so much. And we are so glad to have you here and your support. And so I guess I'm not sure if we have audience questions yet, but I guess one thing that I really appreciated about the Can't Pay Won't Pay book was how sort of in depth you went into this question of financial capitalism, and sort of also how it impacts our organizing. So I guess one question that I had was if you could talk a little bit more about, I guess, sort of the causes of that financialization and sort of how it impacts our organizing.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that led me on this path personally was that I was reading a lot about the changes to our economy. So again, what we could call financialization, neoliberalism. So reading David Harvey, reading all this economic history. And, my question is always, okay, well, what are we gonna do about it? And, at the heart of that analysis is just the way that a financialization has become, it's sort of infiltrated all of these domains that I think democratic socialists, as a democratic socialist, I think this, and many do, should be decommodified. They shouldn't be treated as commodities. They should be democratized. They should be public. And so you see this in when you kind of zoom in, you see this in almost every realm of our life. And it's interesting because financial power can be kind of big and abstract and hard to see, right? Where is it? And so you have to follow those threads down to your daily life, to your lived experience. Again, it's, the fact that instead of education being a public good covered by grants from the government, like it was for people who studied on the GI Bill, or it was for those students in the 1960s before Ronald Reagan tried to ruin their lives, right? It was just something that you're entitled to and the state paid for it. It's how it is in many other countries. But now there's a complicated system of lending. So there's all of these loan servicers and all of these middlemen who profit, but also make life much more make things much more complex. I think this is also part of the Debt Collective's project. We're not just in the red, which is a way of saying we're in debt. We're also in the dark. A lot of people we find when we begin organizing with them, they don't even know who they owe money to or what they owe money to. They sometimes don't even know exactly how much. So financialization, this is an aspect that's rarely discussed, but just that it adds all these layers of complexity and bureaucracy and confusion, and that's part of its power over us. Another area that we're beginning to work on that I think you can see this in is even around criminal justice or criminal injustice, however you want to describe it. So we have a suite of tools on our website where you can dispute debts. Again, this whole principle of making challenges to your economic condition easier than they would be normally by making debt dispute tools that are user-friendly, that are on your phone and legible. So we're building a tool that will help people in California dispute bail bonds and immigration bonds. And, the prison system is the prison jail systems are public, but they're public in obviously a really terrible, oppressive way. But people in California, basically there's still a cash bail system, and that's kind of a misnomer. It's really a credit bail system. So what happens is people go into debt just to get their loved ones out of jail, right? So there's a kind of way in which these financial entities even have their tendrils in that in that domain of life. So what we're interested in is sort of following these chains of debt up so that we can identify new targets and figure out how we can rein in the power of the financial sector at this moment. And of course, we have to do lots of things, right? It's not just the banks that are our enemies, but they do fund, they have outsized power, they direct investment, they fund a lot of terrible things. Fossil fuels are one of them. As I said, they do not allocate capital in any reasonable way. They allocate it to maximize profit and in ways that impinge and control and limit our lives. And so it's an extremely important area for us to address, given the reality, given the economic conditions and the way our economy is organized at this moment. And I think it's interesting we're at a moment where I was reading yesterday, where the Biden administration is staffing up their agencies, and one question is, are we going to now see, and we will, a bunch of people in positions of power and oversight who basically were, part of the 2008 banking crisis, which was the last big opportunity to rein in this sector. And so, we know that, again, this is a way in which our debts are never, it's not an individual condition, because we know that in total, that these shenanigans and these games, what happened in 2008 was basically, there were a bunch of predatory mortgage given out, and then they bought and sold them and gave them AAA ratings when they didn't deserve them. And it brought down the economy, decimated the wealth of Black and Latino families in particular, but plenty of other people. Millions of people lost their homes. And so we know that this is also a system that has devastating consequences.
Hi, Astra. Thanks so much for speaking with us again today. I'm going to ask a question that Mike put in the chat and that I echoed and elaborated. So Mike asked very simply, why not tax the rich to pay off the debt? And I had the same question. And furthermore, I was curious, right, if, like whether that claim that we can achieve these goals without targeting capitalist wealth kind of subverts or also kind of claims implicitly that kind of class struggle, that element of class struggle is not necessary. So what would you say about taxing the rich?
Oh, I absolutely think we should tax the rich. I don't think we should tax them to pay off debts. I think the debt should be abolished, right? Like the idea that debts have to be paid is a myth. And one thing we saw in 2008 was banks were saved despite their debts and their bad bets. And earlier in 2020, what we saw was massive corporate debt relief. So in 2020, part of the problem for companies and why there was this crisis in the economy was that the corporate sector was just incredibly over leveraged. They had all these bad debts. So what happened? Steve Mnuchin made it a priority to save them, to save corporate debtors. The government stepped in and was like, we've got this, don't worry, you won't have to go through bankruptcy. So, we want to tax the rich. We want to tax the rich mainly so that they don't have incredible economic power and a kind of anti-democratic power. But we don't need to, we don't need them to pay off the debts. Like, one thing that, Congress can, the federal government can seize debts. It can seize property, right? So it could seize past due medical debts and just extinguish them. Again, we're not asking for anyone to pay anything to cancel federal student loans. The government simply has to stop collecting. What we want then is for the federal government to provide free, quality, beautiful public education for anyone who wants it, so that people can learn without having to think of themselves as, without having that anxiety of like, okay, now I'm going to have to get a return on investment and I'm going to have to get a really high paying job so that I can pay off my debts. So, I might want to be a public interest lawyer, but I'm going to go work on Wall Street instead, right? Like, we want to couple debt relief with the provision of the public goods that we deserve. So we want medical debt cancellation coupled with Medicare for all, right? We want the end of the payday lending industry coupled with high wages, dignified and meaningful work, and a jobs guarantee and all of that. So I think we should tax the rich because there just shouldn't be obscenely rich people.
Awesome.
But the rich get their debts canceled all the time. I mean, look at former President Trump, right? I mean, was the king, he called himself the king of debt. So there's also this incredible double standard there where wealthy people know how to leverage their debts and they can walk away when it's convenient. And so it's one of those things, there's that meme, right? Like, this is cool if you're rich and this is like, what's classy if you're rich or something, and not if you're poor. And, bankruptcy is one of those things. Like, rich people go through bankruptcy and they're savvy, and poor people go through bankruptcy and they're considered, moral failures. So yeah, don't pay these debts. We need them to be abolished. And we're very clear about the language of abolition because we don't like forgiveness. We think you don't need to be forgiven for having medical debts. You didn't do anything wrong. You don't need to be forgiven for having student loans. You didn't do anything wrong, right? You're asking for justice, which is a different paradigm.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a really helpful and compelling response. I want to also ask Emmeline's question in the chat. Could you elaborate a bit more on the causes of financialization under capitalism and how it impacts our organizing?
Yeah, I mean, so, the causes are that there are different interpretations of what it is exactly that happened in the 1970s that caused this neoliberal revolution. I mean, there was part of it was a sort of ideological formation that came into being, and part of it was just a conscious corporate counterattack on the what some people called the excessive democracy of the 60s, right? There were all these social movements, civil rights, women's rights, gay liberation. There were a lot of wildcat strikes, and they were basically like, we need to suppress all of this and de-democratize society. And again, you had, these sort of figures like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher rise to power, and they used the rhetoric of the free market, but really they weren't interested in the free market. They were interested in wielding the power of the state to protect markets from democracy, from regular people, right? From the prospect of anything resembling socialism. And this allowed the financial sector to bloat, to become more powerful. So for example, until the 80s, there were limits on usury, right? Which is that means a limit on how much interest somebody can charge you for a loan. And that's sort of an ancient principle, that there's something immoral about charging people huge sums of interest when they need to borrow money. But in the 80s, they were like, no, it's a free for all, right? So that was part of it, was just deregulating the banking sector, famously, right? Getting rid of Glass-Steagall. Why do we need these protections from the New Deal era? Let's let these investors, they're so smart. Let's let them play around with regular people's deposits. Who cares that it puts the entire economy at risk? So the financial sector was, very strategic about getting rid of regulations, and about presenting the idea that they knew best, and that they finance and all these things should be left to them, right? Left to the bankers, left to the experts. For our organizing, I think it means we have to see that this is how the economy is organized and address it. And so we have to look at ways, again, follow these chains of debt. How does it impact? How does it impact a situation? So, I think a robust movement for free, public higher education needs lots of things. It needs teachers and faculty unions fighting for that agenda. It needs students fighting for that agenda. It needs communities recognizing like, hey, we'll be better off if the rising generation isn't buried in debt. And it needs a debtor's angle too, an angle where you go, oh, we actually see the way these student loan servicers work and how they actually ultimately, the people who hold the institution that holds this debt is the federal government. So it's one part of, it needs to be part of any campaign, I think, that is aimed at aimed at providing public goods. There's also the way that our communities, I'm thinking of local governments and cities are affected by financialization. So what you should do now, city, there's arguments now about how the federal government can print money and deficit spend. It definitely can't deficit spend. That's true. Cities, for example, can't deficit spend endlessly. They can't print money. They have to tax the rich in order to provide the services the community needs, the schools, the roads, the parks, all of that. But what we've done is we've moved away from that model. And what we do instead is we borrow from rich people. That's what bonds are. Bonds are saying, hey, rich people, we're not going to tax you to pay for things, but instead the school is going to issue a bond. So we'll borrow your money. Could we have it, please? And we'll pay you interest, often without charging you tax on it. Like, that's just twisted. It becomes, we shouldn't be like, we need your money, so we're going to give you this incentive to lend it to us. It's like, no, you should be taxed to fund public goods. So that's an example of financialization, in our communities. It's part of why our communities are impoverished at this moment. And it leads to things like municipalities going bankrupt when they shouldn't be.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There's a couple really good questions in the Q&A. So I think I'm going to ask Steph's question first. So they say that, it seems like somehow the political climate is friendlier right now to the notion of debt cancellation than to free, tuition-free college. Obviously, the two are tied together. So how can we work to address both?
Yeah, I think we do absolutely need to address both, because they're, sometimes you need to, a phrase that you will hear from many Marxists is enhance the contradictions, right? And so when you push the issue of debt cancellation, people's brains go like, okay, but hold on, it doesn't solve the problem, which is true. It doesn't, right? That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because it's a way to materially improve people's lives. And it's a way to show that all debts don't have to be paid, that debts can be erased. And sometimes we've made a mistake and we just need to admit it, and we need to do what we can to set things right. But it absolutely invites the question, like, okay, well, how do we prevent this problem in the future? And the only logical thing to do is to make college publicly funded and free. I think there's so many interesting, I think we have to seize this moment and organize. The answer, as often is the case with things, is organize, 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 right? This moment of pandemic doesn't just make the case for debt cancellation more urgent. It actually makes the case for free college more urgent. This is what I wrote at length in the New Republic piece I mentioned. The only rational source of funding for universities is public money. Because what did we see at this pandemic? A lot of students who were saying, hold on, should I really be paying the sky-high tuition because of COVID? Or maybe I don't want to go to class in this moment. Also, so that caused tuition revenues to contract. Also, universities had been bringing in more revenue for things like sports. Suddenly there weren't stadiums full of people, right? So that money was gone. So all of these other things that universities were doing to bring in revenue collapsed. And so what you realize there is like, okay, yeah, public funding is actually what is stable and viable. I think there's a bigger philosophical question about what we mean by a public institution and what we mean by free. Because I want schools to be free as in cost and free as in aimed at liberation. You're not on a free campus if you're being heavily policed in a racist manner or just policed in an oppressive way at all. You're not free if you are only able to study in a vocational mode and not able to explore and learn widely, right? You're not free if you're it's not a free education if you're in a, if you're suffering from, if your school system's suffering from austerity and the building's crumbling, or if you're being taught by an adjunct who's working multiple jobs, right, without healthcare. And so I actually have a film coming up on the Intercept website that's a kind of collaboration with the Debt Collective called You Are Not Alone, where some debt strikers, people with the Debt Collective, I host this conversation, and the economist Stephanie Kelton and the historian Barbara Ransby and the political philosopher Wendy Brown, and we kind of dig into this question of like, well, what is the horizon that we're really reaching towards? Like, what would liberatory democratic public education be, and what are some of the pitfalls as we make that demand, as we make free college demand? What are some of the pitfalls we want to avoid? But I think now is the time to push that as a movement demand.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I see Mike has another question, so some context. When a union pension fund buys the bonds sold by government agency and the bonds are defaulted, either the workers lose or other workers are taxed to pay off the debts. So the question is, if a union pension fund buys debt, will they be hurt if debt is canceled?
Yeah. They shouldn't be, right? I mean, this is the thing. We have to fight so that people aren't this bind. This is one way financialization it impacts us. I think pensions are a really important example. I mean, we see workers' pensions investing in things like Uber, right? In big tech companies that hurt workers. And this is because we should have public retirement. I mean, I think there's a bigger question here about the fact that this is the way that so many public service workers are securing their futures. But yeah, I mean, this is a real problem. So I'm not going to say, I can't really say, oh, it would never happen, right? This is one of the dilemmas that we have to face head on. And it's interesting because so many of these financial relationships actually point to the question of retirement, right? Like, why are we so obsessed with homeownership? Well, part of it is we want a place to live, but also, the baby boomer generation was able to basically use their investments in their houses and property as kind of, a retirement account, right? So you could know, okay, I'm going to have a safe and secure old age. And so, pensions are a really critical thing to think about. I think it's an important example of financialization. It shows the way we're both kind of often that some people, not everyone, because not everyone has a pension, right? Not everyone has a 401k. But, where people have relationships where they're kind of both debtors and creditors in complex ways, and we're really tied up in these systems. So it's something, that's something that people would have to fight for, is a just settlement to these issues, right? And to say, okay, who is made whole? I mean, when companies go bankrupt, there's always this question of like, well, who's made whole first? Typically workers are at the bottom. So part of what we want to do is reevaluate, who is the first creditor at the table. And we actually did this in an interesting way with the Corinthian debt strikers, because Corinthian colleges collapsed. It went bankrupt. And so we asserted them through a legal means. We asserted them then as creditors. We turned the debtors into creditors and saying, hold on, Corinthian, you have to pay these people who you screwed over first. So there's all sorts of complexities. I think we have to think about the individual cases, but the question is spot on.
Awesome, thank you. I see Eli has a question, but I think it's a really good question to end on, so I'm going to hold it for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question, and if anybody else wants to put any in the chat or the Q&A, we probably have time for maybe like one more beyond that. So my other question is, so does arguing in favor of monetary sovereignty for all countries kind of like reify the form that the international economy takes in this division into national units? And so likewise, how do we eventually go beyond national monetary sovereignty towards like the abolition of capitalism and an internationalist, like socialist society?
I don't have a perfect blueprint for my future democratic socialist internationalist order, I'm sad to say. I mean, it's interesting. This is something I explore this, like I gesture towards, the problem, which is a real problem in the film I made that was released in 2018 called What is Democracy? And one thing that film underscores, but I think is really interesting, is if we look back through history, is how debtors' revolts have been tied to democratic progress. So you go back to the ancient world, and it was often debtors rising up and refusing to pay their debts that created these sort of democratic breakthroughs. And so it's this history, we can't just think in terms of the shift to financialization in the late 70s. We also have to think about how we have to go back to the New Deal era and think about how access to credit on fair terms backed by the federal government created the white middle class, right? That certain people were able to get loans in a kind of reasonable way. And that built, the mythic American dream and the class of people who had access to it. You go back further and you get this ancient history of debtors' revolts and jubilees. So in that film, I kind of gesture towards that long history and then look at the example of Greece. I was there filming in 2015, 16, when there was the the debt crisis, the sovereign debt crisis. And basically they didn't have monetary sovereignty, right? They're part of the European Union, which is a currency union. And so they couldn't, they couldn't muster the power to renegotiate their debts. And that points to the fact that, I guess the monetary sovereignty thing is important, right? Because that was an example where a country didn't have sovereignty and so wasn't able to use the financial or, monetary tools it might have had. But it also to me pointed to the fact that, one country can't do it alone. So this idea that like nationalism or retreating to the national level is going to bring us, a kind of, unproblematically a different economic paradigm just doesn't seem valid to me. I mean, I think what's interesting is that we have so many international institutions, but it's like we have the wrong ones, right? Like instead of a global EPA that's like really functional, we have the WTO. Instead of a robust, international labor organization, we have a shell of what we should have. So I'm kind of, again, I don't have the blueprint. I think part of what's interesting about movements is that so many of these questions, like we really have to think together. And one thing I'm fond of saying is that for me, my vision of democratic socialism is a world in which we have like way more interesting political and philosophical debates, because right now under capitalism as we know it, we're like, should billionaires exist? Like, hold on, like should like 4 or 5 people really have all of that money? And should a few guys be on the brink of being trillionaires so they get to colonize Mars? I mean, it's like the answer is just so obviously no. It's such a boring question. The question of how you create a just, and not just, but like a reparative global economic system, a system that repairs all of the violence of colonialism, of extraction, of capitalism, and also can set us on a course to a sustainable future where generations to come have a chance at a decent life. Like we don't know the answer to that yet. But I think, and there's a tension there I do think there's a tension. We do have to build power. You can't skip to this global level. You do have to build power where you are, right? Not necessarily nationally. I mean, sometimes the federal government's a target, but if we want to have these global ambitions, it actually will require, really rooting ourselves in communities, in relationships of solidarity, and in a power analysis, so we can have a chance of being the internationalists that leftists have long aspired to be.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to ask 2 more questions. One of them is, you've kind of touched on a little bit. So coming back to the idea of free college and student debt and its connection with all, that it's all interconnected, even retirement, all of this. Is it even possible to get student debt cancellation without achieving full social democracy or democratic socialism?
Yeah, I think so. Achieving full democratic socialism is a big ambition. Like canceling all student debt is low-hanging fruit. So that's part of why I'm going for it. It's like, it really is low-hanging fruit. Why? I mean, it's harder to win things that require investment. That's why it's hard to win Medicare for all, or why it's harder to win free college. Now, I think we should fight for those things urgently in the now. I think we could have universal healthcare before we have democratic socialism. That might be because I'm a dual citizen of Canada, but I have seen it with my own eyes. But debt cancellation is low-hanging fruit. It costs the government nothing. And in fact, there are a lot, I don't like to lean on them, but there are lots of economic arguments for doing so. There are an increasing number of mainstream economists who say this has gotten so out of hand. It's dragging the economy. I mean, there's a whole generation of people who are delaying having families. They're never going to own homes. In fact, they can't even afford rent. So they're living with their parents if they have that ability, what we could even consider a privilege, right? They're not starting businesses, so it's suppressing entrepreneurialism, and also that student debt cancellation would allow all of the money currently going to loan servicers to go into the economy to support businesses as we know it and stuff like that. So there's just, it's one of these things where you can emphasize those values if that's what matters to you. So and again, it doesn't require, it doesn't cost business anything. Like I was reading a brilliant history called Enabling Acts about the passage of the ADA, the Americans with the Disability Rights Act. And this is something that forced businesses to spend money on ramps and adaptations, right? And that was something that was passed under a Republican in like 1991, 1992. So I don't know, to me, I can't bear the idea that we can't do this, right? It's this, again, this should be low hanging fruit, which is why I call everyone to join us in this quest. This is achievable, right? This is something that can actually be done. We're not asking for very much. And I hope that getting it will motivate us to ask for more, because again, we're entitled to a lot more than just a debt jubilee.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask.
Somebody said something I think which is really a point on with not if you can alleviate suffering with a signature, to not do this is a policy choice, and it's the choice to continue this failure and this violence, right? And I think framing is that it's not a big ask, and in fact, what's telling is not doing it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is gonna be the last question that I'm gonna ask on behalf of our participants, and then I'm gonna pass it over to our tuition strikers to transition to the next panel. So thank you so much, Astra, for coming to speak with us today, and thanks everyone for coming to this panel. So I think Eli's question is, I think, a really great note to end on. Could you tell us a little bit more about the strategy for the Biden Jubilee 100 campaign and how the Debt Collective and DSA can work together in coalition?
I love it. Yeah, the Biden Jubilee 100 campaign, in a way, is modeled on the Corinthian 15 that I told you about. These for-profit college strikers that declared non-payment or politicized what they were already doing. Many of them are already not paying and suffering the consequences, and then through various strategies, pressured the Obama administration into canceling debt. So I think we have to be realistic about where our leverage is at this moment, right? One of the things about student debt that's actually unique is that, again, it's not needed for the economy or for the government to function. There's been a student loan suspension thanks to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump has issued more debt relief than any Democratic at this point. So so that's also a telling thing. But people haven't been paying their loans since March. And, it hasn't brought down the system. So that is proof that these loans, that's kind of piece of evidence that, it's not going to cause a crisis if these loans are canceled. But it also points to the fact that the leverage there isn't strictly economic, right? Because millions and millions of people are defaulting. We need to create a kind of moral movement. And I think to create policy pressure and political power to get this done. And certainly there's been a seismic shift in the political discussion of this issue. I mean, we went from being mocked 10 years ago for raising the idea of debt cancellation and free college to having a growing number of allies in Washington pushing this and shifting the public discourse. So I think this is something where, it's actually, a lot of this campaign is about building the political pressure and the public will to do it, and to just remind the powerful that this is actually not a heavy lift, and it's the least they can fucking do to improve people's lives in a pandemic. And so the strategy, is one of, targeting representatives, making noise about this. We will have various direct actions to come. We've structured this campaign around the first 100 days. And if it's not done, there will definitely be further escalation. So this isn't over. But right now, I think, we would love to have a co-hosted event with YDSA, maybe at the Department of Education, some direct actions. And it's something that every representative should hear about, because, there aren't a lot of issues where I would say this, but this is one, but this is actually a bipartisan issue. This is something that's actually really popular across the political spectrum, which, it's understandable why. It's like, do you want your debt canceled? Yes or no? Most people like that idea. And so, we should expand the group of representatives who have endorsed this beyond the wonderful squad and people who are obviously on our side. Because I think this is something, overcoming that shame and stigma, that sense that, okay, as a debtor, you're just doomed to suffer. I mean, the truth is people want that lifeline. People don't want to fucking feel like it's their fault that they're economically struggling. And so I think this is something that we can really build a big movement of people who are ready to not just see their debts canceled, but have a different perception of themselves and what they're entitled to.
Right, amazing. Thanks so much, Astra. This was so helpful and informative. I'm going to make just a few announcements before we move to our next panel. So I shared the link to the Debt Collective website in the chat, so you can check out the organizing that they're doing. And also there's some actions here for the tuition strike. Like I said earlier, we're doing a letter campaign, as well as circulating the strike fund. So both of those links are there if you want to help out with that. Strongly encourage you to join DSA or YDSA if you're a student. And I also especially want to plug this panel on February 5th that we're doing, because Astra will also, this is another collaboration between YDSA and Debt Collective that we're doing. Here, I'll share the link to that. As well as the YDSA Winter Conference, which is going to be really exciting. Sorry, let me share this in the chat. And then also just want to plug again the petition for Mobilize African Diaspora, which is one of our coalition partners. So with that, I will hand it over to Becca to introduce the next panel.